A mother bobcat was trapped on train tracks, her paw caught in a steel trap, with her two frightened cubs by her side. As a train rumbled closer, their chance of survival seemed impossible. The countryside was calm in the early morning light. A thin layer of mist covered the fields, slowly lifting as the sun rose higher. Birds chirped softly from the trees lining the dirt road, their sounds blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the kind of peaceful morning that seemed like nothing could go wrong. But just beyond this calm, something terrible was happening. On the train tracks that stretched across the open fields, a mother bobcat and her two cubs were in trouble. The mother's front paw was caught in a trap clamped to the rails. The sharp edges of the metal had dug into her fur and skin, making her struggles painful and pointless. Her cubs, too small to understand the full danger, pressed close to her, their tiny bodies trembling. Their soft cries broke the stillness, each sound a call for help. In the distance, the low rumble of a train began to grow louder. The tracks gave off a faint hum, a warning of what was coming. The mother bobcat pulled harder against the trap, her growl filled with fear and determination. She was desperate to protect her cubs, but the cruel trap kept her firmly in place. The cubs whimpered louder as if they could sense the growing danger. Sam Thompson, a retired wildlife photographer, was out for his morning walk. He carried a camera slung over his shoulder, hoping to capture the beauty of the sunrise. Sam had spent much of his life outdoors, following trails of animals and capturing their stories through his lens. But this morning, Sam's heart raced as the train's whistle blared again, cutting through the still morning air like a sharp alarm. The tracks beneath his boots vibrated steadily now, a reminder of how little time he had. He knelt near the mother bobcat, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Her golden eyes locked onto his, full of fear but also exhaustion. She growled low and deep, her body crouched protectively over her cubs. "I'm not here to hurt you," Sam whispered, his voice steady and calm. He glanced at the cubs, who pressed closer to their mother, their tiny cries growing louder. "I'm trying to help." The trap was old but solid, its metal edges rusted but sharp. It had been bolted tightly to the rail as if someone wanted to make sure whatever it caught couldn't escape. Sam cursed under his breath, gripping the trap with both hands. His fingers slipped against the cold steel as he pulled. It didn't budge. The rumble of the train was growing louder now. Sam risked a quick glance down the tracks. The front of the train was visible in the distance, its headlights cutting through the morning haze. He had seconds, not minutes. The mother bobcat growled again, snapping her teeth in warning. Sam didn't flinch. "I know you're scared," he said softly, his voice firm but kind. "But I need you to trust me, just for a little while." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded multi-tool he always carried. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. His hands moved quickly, trying to loosen the rusted bolts holding the trap in place. The tool slipped on the first try, and Sam muttered a frustrated, "Come on!" The train's whistle blasted, louder than ever. The vibrations in the rails made his hands tremble as he worked. The cubs cried louder, pressing themselves against their mother, who stayed as still as she could, her sharp eyes darting between Sam and the oncoming train. Finally, one of the bolts gave way with a loud creak. Sam tugged hard, loosening the trap enough to shift it slightly. The mother bobcat yowled in pain as the metal dug into her paw, but she didn't attack. It was as if she understood he was trying to help. Sam's chest tightened. "Just a little more," he said, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. The train's engine roared, deafening now. The ground felt like it was shaking under Sam's knees. He yanked on the trap with all his strength, his arms burning as the final bolt gave way. The trap opened, and the mother bobcat's paw slipped free. She stumbled, her legs shaky, but she didn't run. Her eyes stayed on her cubs, who clung to her side. Sam grabbed the cubs gently, their small bodies wriggling in his hands. "Come on, girl," he called to the mother as he backed away from the tracks, holding the cubs close to his chest. The train was only seconds away. The whistle was deafening, the headlights blinding. Sam could feel the heat from the engine as he leaped off the tracks, the mother bobcat limping closely behind him. They hit the ground just as the train roared past, the rush of air whipping at Sam's face and the cub's soft fur. For a moment, there was only the sound of the train fading into the distance. Sam lay on his back in the grass, gasping for air, the cubs still clutched in his arms. The mother bobcat stood a few feet away, watching him Sam stood for a moment, catching his breath and watching the Bobcat family. The mother limped heavily on her injured paw, but she stayed close to her cubs, nudging them along as they huddled against her for comfort. Sam's eyes moved to the trap he'd just wrestled off the rail. The rusted metal glinted dully in the sunlight, a cruel reminder of someone's heartless intent. He shook his head and turned his attention back to the animals. "You need care," he said softly, his voice steady but concerned. "And it looks like I'm the only one around to help." The mother bobcat growled softly as he approached, her ears flattened against her head. Sam moved slowly, keeping his hands open and his posture non-threatening. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help." After a few tense moments, she let him come closer. Sam carefully gathered the cubs first, cradling their small, squirming bodies against his chest. The mother followed closely, her golden eyes fixed on him with a mixture of caution and trust. He led them to his truck parked along the dirt road. With a bit of coaxing, the mother bobcat climbed into the open bed, her cubs placed gently beside her on an old blanket Sam had spread out. The drive back to the cabin was quiet except for the occasional whimper from the cubs and a low growl from the mother whenever Sam glanced back. His cabin, tucked away in a grove of pines on the edge of the wilderness, was both a home and a sanctuary. Years of working with wildlife had left him with a modest but well-equipped space for temporary animal care. Sam had always believed that nature had its own way of healing, but sometimes even nature needed a little help. As he pulled into the driveway, Sam glanced at the animals in the back of his truck. "Welcome to your temporary home," he said, as if they could understand. The mother bobcat stared back at him, her gaze unblinking. He carried the cubs inside first, placing them carefully in a large crate lined with clean towels. Then he turned to the mother, who had climbed out of the truck and was limping toward the cabin, her body low and her movements wary. Sam opened the door wide and stepped aside, letting her decide if she would follow. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped inside, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. "Good girl," Sam said, shutting the door behind her. Inside, the main room of the cabin was simple but warm. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and shelves lined with books and jars of herbs filled the walls. The table was scattered with notebooks and sketches of animals Sam had seen during his hikes. One corner of the room was set up as a small animal clinic with basic medical supplies and a padded table for treating injuries. Sam approached the mother bobcat slowly, kneeling down to inspect her injured paw. She flinched but didn't pull away as he gently lifted it. The cuts from the trap were deep, but thankfully, there were no broken bones. "You're lucky," he said softly. "This could have been a lot worse." He worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with warm water and applying an antiseptic. The mother bobcat growled softly but stayed still, her eyes watching his every move. Once her paw was bandaged, Sam turned his attention to the cubs. They were unharmed, but clearly shaken, their tiny bodies trembling as they pressed against each other in the crate. After setting out water and a bowl of shredded chicken for the mother, Sam leaned back against the wall, watching the small family settle into their temporary space. The cubs nuzzled close to their mother, who lay curled protectively around them. Sam exhaled deeply, his mind already racing with questions. Who had set the trap, and why on the train tracks of all places? He'd seen poachers and careless hunters before, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. As the mother bobcat's breathing slowed and the cubs finally began to relax, Sam stood and walked to the window. The fields stretched out in the distance, bathed in the warm light of the rising sun. The peaceful view felt at odds with the cruelty he'd just witnessed. He couldn't change what had happened to the bobcats, but he could make sure they recovered and eventually returned to the wild. He turned back to the animals and nodded to himself. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, "one step at a time." Later that morning, Sam sat at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He stared at the rusted trap he had placed on the floor, its sharp edges still smeared with traces of the mother bobcat's fur. The more he looked at it, the more questions filled his mind. Why would someone set a trap like this on active train tracks? And what kind of person could be so heartless as to leave animals to such a fate? The quiet in the cabin was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. The door creaked open, and Ethan, Sam's teenage grandson, stepped inside. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, and his face carried the usual mix of disinterest and frustration. Ethan had been staying with Sam for the summer, sent by his parents in the hopes that a few months in the countryside might straighten him out. So far, the results had been mixed. "Morning," Sam said, glancing at him. "Morning," Ethan mumbled, dropping his bag near the door. His eyes briefly flicked to the crate in the corner where the cubs were curled up together. "What's that?" "Bobcats," Sam replied simply, taking a sip of his coffee. "Found them on the tracks this morning. Their mother was caught in a trap." Ethan's expression shifted slightly, curiosity mixed with something else, something harder to read. "Are they okay?" "They will be," Sam said, setting his mug down. "But that trap," he nodded toward the twisted metal. "Someone set it on the tracks. On purpose." Ethan shrugged, avoiding Sam's gaze. "Probably just some stupid kids messing around." "Maybe," Sam replied, watching him closely. "But it's more than just stupid. It's cruel." Ethan stuffed his hands into his pockets and leaned against the counter. "I mean, it's not like they meant to hurt them, right? Just scared them or whatever." Sam frowned. There was something in Ethan's tone, an edge of defensiveness. Before he could press further, a knock sounded at the door. Sam stood and opened it to find his neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, standing on the porch. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, known for keeping tabs on everything that happened in the area. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and she wore a frown that suggested she had news to share. "Morning, Sam," she said, glancing past him into the cabin. "Heard about the Bobcats?" "Word travels fast," Sam replied with a small smile. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Callahan stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I thought you should know. Some of the kids around here have been acting up lately. A few of them were seen near the tracks a couple of nights ago. Your grandson was with them." Sam's stomach tightened, but he kept his face calm. "Ethan?" She nodded. "Him and those two boys he's been hanging out with, Trevor and Luke. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, but—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. "Thanks for letting me know," Sam said, his voice steady. "I'll handle it." After Mrs. Callahan left, Sam turned back to find Ethan still leaning against the counter, his expression guarded. Sam folded his arms and fixed him with a level gaze. "Want to tell me what you were doing near the tracks the other night?" Ethan's face flushed and he looked away. "Nothing, just hanging out." "Ethan," Sam said firmly, "don't lie to me. Were you and your friends involved in this?" For a moment, Ethan didn't answer. Then his shoulders slumped. "We didn't think it would hurt anything," he muttered. "It was Trevor's idea. He said it'd be funny to see if it scared some animals. We didn't think—" "You didn't think at all," Sam interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "Do you know what could have happened if I hadn't been there? Those animals would have died, Ethan. That's not a prank. It's cruelty." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes were filled with guilt. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Sam took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Sorry isn't enough. You're going to help me take care of them until they're ready to go back into the wild, and you're going to think about what it means to be responsible for the harm you've caused." Ethan hesitated, but then he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded back, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Good. Now let's get to work." As Ethan moved toward the crate to help with the cubs, Sam watched him closely. There was guilt in the boy's eyes, but also the faintest glimmer of something else, a willingness to make things right. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The sun was high in the sky when Sam and Ethan stepped outside to begin tending to the bobcats. Ethan carried a small bowl of water and a plate with strips of chicken, his movements slow and hesitant. The cubs were still curled together in the crate, their tiny bodies rising and falling as they dozed, while the mother bobcat lay nearby on the blanket Sam had set up earlier. Her golden eyes tracked every movement, her ears twitching at the smallest sounds. Ethan knelt a few feet away from the mother, carefully sliding the bowl of water toward her. "Here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're thirsty, right?" The mother bobcat growled faintly, but didn't move. Sam, watching from a few steps back, crossed his arms and nodded. "She's scared, Ethan. Keep your movements slow and steady. Let her know you're not a threat." Ethan did as he was told, retreating a few steps once the bowl was close enough for the bobcat to reach. She sniffed the air cautiously before lowering her head to lap at the water. Ethan let out a quiet breath, as though he had been holding it the whole time. She trusts you a little, Sam said, his tone encouraging. That's a start. But Ethan didn't respond. His gaze drifted to the rusty trap Sam had propped against the cabin wall. The jagged metal was a harsh contrast to the peaceful surroundings. Ethan's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Sam thought he might say something. Instead, the boy stood abruptly and muttered, "I'll be inside." Sam let him go, deciding it was better to give him space for now. He crouched down near the crate, reaching in to gently stroke one of the cubs. Its small body trembled slightly under his touch, but it didn't pull away. "You're tough, little one," he murmured. "You'll be back in the wild soon enough." As the afternoon wore on, Ethan stayed inside, occasionally peeking out the window, but avoiding Sam. By the time dinner rolled around, Sam decided it was time for a real conversation. He set 2 plates on the small kitchen table, grilled chicken, green beans, and potatoes, and called for Ethan. The boy shuffled into the room, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He sat down without a word, picking at his food as though it were a chore. Sam ate in silence for a while, letting the quiet settle between them. Then he set his fork down and fixed Ethan with a steady gaze. "We need to talk," Sam said, his voice firm but not harsh. "About the trap, and about what you and your friends were doing on the tracks." Ethan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He didn't look up. "I already said I'm sorry." "And I believe you," Sam replied. "But saying sorry isn't enough. I need to know why." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't my idea," he muttered. "Trevor and Luke thought it'd be funny to see if we could scare some animals. They dared me to help. I didn't think—" His voice trailed off. "You didn't think it'd hurt anyone?" Sam finished for him. "But it did, Ethan. Those animals could have been killed. And that mother Bobcat, she's still scared out of her mind." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean for it to get that bad," he said quietly. "I wasn't trying to hurt them." Sam leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I know you weren't. But intent doesn't erase the damage. What matters now is what you do to make it right." Ethan glanced at him, guilt and frustration flickering across his face. "What do you want me to do?" "You're going to help me take care of them," Sam said firmly. "Every day you'll feed them, clean up after them, and make sure they're ready to go back to the wild. You'll take responsibility, not just for what happened, but for making things better." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around his fork. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." Sam nodded back, satisfied for now. "Good. We start first thing tomorrow." As Ethan returned to his food, Sam felt a small sense of relief. The boy had taken the first step. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the quiet of the kitchen, with the smell of dinner in the air and the soft sounds of the bobcat stirring in the other room, Sam allowed himself a rare moment of hope. The next morning, Ethan stood in the backyard, arms crossed, watching as Sam prepared the day's tasks. The Bobcat family was still in the makeshift enclosure Sam had set up using sturdy wire fencing and a shaded corner of the yard. The cubs paced nervously, their tiny tails twitching, while their mother lay nearby, her injured paw tucked protectively beneath her. Sam handed Ethan a bucket filled with supplies, gloves, a feeding dish, and fresh water. "You'll start by feeding them," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Move slow, keep your voice calm, and don't make sudden movements." Ethan frowned, gripping the bucket tightly. "What if she attacks me?" "She won't," Sam replied. "She's scared, not aggressive. But if you give her a reason to think her cubs are in danger, then yes, she'll defend them. The trick is to show her you're not a threat." Ethan hesitated, looking at the bobcat's sharp teeth and claws. Sam could see the doubt in his grandson's eyes. "You got yourself into this mess," Sam reminded him gently. "The only way out is through." Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached the enclosure. The mother bobcat lifted her head, her golden eyes narrowing as she let out a low growl. Ethan froze, looking back at Sam for reassurance. "Keep going," Sam said. "Slow and steady." Ethan crouched down near the fence, sliding the feeding dish and water bowl inside. The cubs scurried closer to their mother, letting out soft whimpers. The mother bobcat stayed still, her eyes locked on Ethan. For a moment, it felt like a standoff. Then, cautiously, she leaned forward, sniffing the food. Ethan exhaled, relieved. "She's eating," he said, glancing back at Sam. "Good," Sam replied with a small nod. "Now, clean out the old dish and refill the water, then we'll move on." Over the next few days, Ethan fell into a routine. Each morning he would feed the bobcats, clean their enclosure, and watch as the cubs grew more confident. At first, the tasks felt like a punishment, but as time passed, something began to change. Ethan found himself paying closer attention to the bobcats' behavior, the way the cubs mimicked their mother's movements, the soft chirps they made when they played, and the way their mother always kept a watchful eye on them, even when she seemed relaxed. One afternoon, Sam handed Ethan a small feather tied to a string. "Time to help the cubs develop their instincts," he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "With this? Bobcats are natural hunters," Sam explained. "The cubs need to practice chasing and pouncing before they're ready for the wild. Use the feather to simulate prey." Feeling a bit silly, Ethan crouched near the enclosure and dangled the feather inside. At first, the cubs just stared at it, their ears twitching. Then, one of them, a bolder cub with a slightly darker coat, sprang forward, swatting at the feather with its tiny paw. Ethan laughed despite himself. "This one's feisty," he said, pulling the feather just out of reach. Sam smiled. "That's a good sign. Keep it up." Over time, Ethan grew especially fond of the bold cub, which he nicknamed Ember for its fiery energy. Ember was always the first to pounce, the first to explore, and the first to investigate whenever Ethan approached the enclosure. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to feel a sense of responsibility, not just because Sam had told him to, but because he genuinely cared. Sam noticed the change in Ethan. The boy, who had started out reluctant and defensive, now showed glimpses of pride and patience. One evening, as they worked together to build a larger enclosure to give the bobcats more room to roam, Sam decided to acknowledge Ethan's progress. "You're doing good work," Sam said, handing Ethan a plank of wood. "They're starting to trust you." Ethan shrugged, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "It's not as hard as I thought it'd be." "It's not about hard or easy," Sam said. "It's about showing up, every day, and doing what needs to be done." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I never really thought about it like that." The next morning, as Ethan crouched near the enclosure, holding the feather toy, Sam watched from the porch. The boy who had once been careless and indifferent was now focused and patient, his every movement a testament to the lessons he was learning. For the first time, Sam felt a flicker of hope, not just for the bobcats, but for Ethan too. The boy was learning to care, to take responsibility, and to see the value in helping something other than himself. As the days turned into weeks, the bobcats grew stronger. The mother's injured paw, once swollen and raw, had healed well under Sam's care. The cubs, once timid and clinging to her side, had become bolder, exploring every corner of their enclosure. Ethan's daily efforts were paying off, though he didn't say it out loud. Sam could see the pride in his grandson's eyes each time the cubs learned something new. One morning, Sam stood with Ethan near the enclosure, holding a bundle of fresh branches and logs. "It's time we gave them a bit more challenge," Sam said. "They need to learn how to climb, hide, and hunt properly if they're going to survive out there." Ethan frowned, taking a log from Sam. "But how do we teach them stuff like that? Isn't it just instinct?" "Instinct gets them halfway," Sam explained. "Experience gets them the rest. If we don't help them now, they won't stand a chance in the wild." Together they arranged the logs and branches in the enclosure, creating a maze of hiding spots, climbing structures, and small obstacles. Sam also brought out a long rope tied with feathers and scraps of fabric to simulate prey. When the cubs were released into the new setup, their reactions were immediate. Ember, true to his name, was the first to pounce on the rope, tugging at it with tiny but fierce growls. His sibling followed hesitantly, and soon the two were chasing the rope in wild circles. Ethan laughed as he dangled the rope just out of reach. "Look at them go," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "Ember's gonna be a terror out there." Sam nodded, a faint smile on his face. "That's what we want. A strong bobcat is a survivor." Later that day, Sam showed Ethan how to prepare food that would mimic what the bobcats might hunt. They stuffed raw chicken into hollowed logs and scattered it throughout the enclosure. The mother bobcat sniffed cautiously at first, but soon she was clawing at the log, pulling out the meat. Her cubs watched closely, then tried to imitate her, their small paws scraping at the wood. "You see that?" Sam said, nudging Ethan's shoulder. "She's teaching them now. That's a good sign." Ethan nodded, watching the scene intently. "It's like they're a team." "They are," Sam said, "and just like them, we've got to do our part to make sure they're ready." Over the next week, the training intensified. Sam and Ethan introduced live prey, small, safe animals like mice, into the enclosure. Ethan had been hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea, but Sam explained its importance. If they can't hunt, they can't survive, he said. This is what they're made for. To Ethan's surprise, Ember was the quickest to adapt. The young cub caught on faster than his sibling, pouncing with precision and delivering clean strikes. Ethan couldn't hide his pride, cheering softly when Ember successfully caught his first mouse. "He's gonna be a beast out there," Ethan said, grinning. But it wasn't just the cubs that were changing. Ethan himself seemed different. He was no longer the restless, defiant teenager Sam had welcomed into his home. He showed up every morning without being asked, ready to feed, clean, and train the bobcats. He asked questions, paid attention to details, and even started suggesting new ideas for their care. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Sam sat on the porch, watching the bobcats settle in their enclosure. The mother lay stretched out, her cubs curled beside her, tired but content after a day of activity. Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think they'll be okay out there?" "They're as ready as they'll ever be," Sam replied. "And they've got each other. That counts for a lot." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's kinda crazy. I didn't think I'd care this much about animals." Sam chuckled softly. "Caring isn't a weakness, Ethan. It's what makes us strong." The next morning, they began preparing for the release. Sam and Ethan loaded a large crate into the back of the truck, lining it with fresh straw to make the trip as comfortable as possible. The enclosure was opened, and with some coaxing, the mother bobcat stepped inside, her cubs following closely. As they secured the crate, Ethan ran his hand along the edge, his face a mix of pride and sadness. "This is it, huh?" Sam placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more for them than most people ever would. Now, it's their turn to take what you've taught them and make it out there." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I just hope it's enough." "It is," Sam said firmly. "You've given them their best chance." As the truck pulled out of the driveway, heading toward the wildlife reserve, the air was heavy with anticipation. Sam glanced at Ethan, who sat quietly in the passenger seat. The boy's transformation over the past weeks mirrored the bobcats. They had all come a long way, and now it was time for the next step. The truck rattled along the dirt road, a cloud of dust trailing behind it. Sam drove carefully, glancing occasionally at the crate secured in the truck bed. Inside, the mother bobcat crouched low, her sharp eyes peering through the gaps in the wood. Her cubs were tucked against her, quiet but alert, as though they could sense something important was about to happen. Ethan sat silently in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed out the window. His hands rested in his lap, but every so often he would clench them into fists and then release them, as if trying to work out the tangle of emotions inside him. He had been unusually quiet since they had loaded the bobcats, and Sam decided to let him process in his own time. The road wound through the forest, the trees growing denser until they arrived at the edge of the wildlife reserve. It was a protected area, miles of untouched wilderness where the bobcats would have the space and resources to thrive. Sam parked near a clearing and shut off the engine. The silence was thick, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird. Ethan climbed out of the truck and walked around to the back, his movements slower than usual. Together, he and Sam lowered the crate to the ground, careful not to jostle its occupants. The mother bobcat let out a low growl, her cubs stirring restlessly beside her. "This is the spot," Sam said, gesturing toward the clearing. "Plenty of cover, good hunting ground, and far enough from human activity to keep them safe." Ethan nodded, but said nothing. He crouched beside the crate, peering through the slats. Ember's tiny face appeared on the other side, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar scents. Ethan smiled faintly, pressing his hand against the wood. "You're gonna do great out here, little guy," he murmured. Sam knelt beside him, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. "Ready?" Ethan took a deep breath, then nodded. Together they unlatched the crate and carefully lifted the door. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother bobcat stayed inside, her golden eyes scanning the clearing. Then, slowly, she stepped out, her injured paw barely noticeable now. Her cubs followed closely, their small bodies moving with cautious curiosity. Ethan sat back on his heels, watching as the bobcats began to explore. The mother sniffed the air, her ears swiveling to pick up every sound. The cubs darted around her, pouncing on leaves and chasing shadows. Ember, as always, was the boldest. venturing a few feet farther than the others before turning back to his family. "They look happy," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "They are," Sam replied. "They're home." The mother bobcat paused, turning back toward the humans who had cared for her and her cubs. For a brief moment, her eyes met Sam's, then Ethan's. It wasn't gratitude, not in the way people understood it, but something quieter, a recognition of safety and trust. Then, she turned and disappeared into the brush, her cubs bounding after her. Ethan let out a shaky breath, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "They're really gone." Sam nodded, standing and offering Ethan a hand to help him up. "That's what we worked for, to give them this chance." Ethan stared at the spot where the bobcats had vanished, a mix of pride and sadness etched on his face. "Do you think they'll be okay?" "They'll be better than okay," Sam said firmly. "They've got each other, and they've got the instincts to survive. You helped make that happen." As they packed up the crate and prepared to leave, Ethan lingered for a moment longer, looking out over the clearing. "I'm gonna miss them," he admitted quietly. "I will too," Sam said. "But this isn't the end. This is the start of their next chapter, and ours." Ethan climbed into the truck, his expression thoughtful as they drove back toward the cabin. For the first time, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went deeper than just finishing a task. He had made a difference, not just for the bobcats, but for himself. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Ethan stared out the window, watching the trees blur together as the truck rumbled along the dirt road. His mind was filled with images of the bobcats, Ember's bold leaps, the mother's steady watchfulness, the way they had melted into the wilderness without looking back. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, a sense of pride in what he'd done. Sam glanced at him occasionally, sensing the boy's mix of emotions. He didn't interrupt, letting Ethan process in his own way. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Sam parked the truck and climbed out, stretching his back with a groan. Ethan followed, his steps slower, more deliberate. As they unloaded the crate, Sam finally broke the silence. "You did good out there, Ethan." Ethan looked up, his expression hesitant. "You really think so?" Sam set the crate down and turned to face him. "I know so. Those bobcats wouldn't have made it without you. And it wasn't just about feeding them or cleaning up after them. You gave them a chance to survive." Ethan shrugged, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "I guess. I didn't think I could do something like that." "Well, now you know," Sam said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've got it in you to make a difference, Ethan. That's no small thing." Inside the cabin, the quiet felt different, less like emptiness and more like peace. Sam brewed a pot of tea, setting 2 mugs on the table. Ethan sat across from him, turning the mug in his hands. "I didn't think it'd feel this weird," he admitted, "them being gone." "That's because you cared," Sam said simply. "Caring about something changes you. It makes you better." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess I didn't care about much before, not like this." Sam leaned back in his chair, studying his grandson. "What about your friends, Trevor and Luke? Have you talked to them since all this started?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really. I mean, they messaged me a couple of times, but I don't know. I don't feel like hanging out with them anymore." "That's your choice," Sam said. "But if you want my advice, you should talk to them. Let them know what you've learned. Maybe they'll listen. Maybe they won't. But at least you'll know you tried." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "You think they could change?" Sam smiled faintly. "If you can, they can. People just need the right push sometimes." Over the next few days, Ethan slowly began reaching out to his friends. He invited them to the cabin, showing them the empty enclosure and explaining the work he had done with the bobcats. At first, Trevor and Luke seemed skeptical, brushing off his words with jokes and shrugs. But as Ethan described the moment that the mother bobcat and her cubs disappeared into the wild, something shifted. They listened, not with the easy laughter they usually shared, but with quiet attention. "You really cared about them, huh?" Trevor said, leaning against the fence. "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "I messed up, but I fixed it, and it felt good." Luke nodded, kicking at the dirt. "Maybe we shouldn't mess around like that anymore." Ethan smiled, a small but genuine grin. "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't." Back at the cabin, Sam noticed the changes in Ethan. The boy who had arrived at the start of the summer, restless and defiant, now carried himself differently. He was calmer, more thoughtful. When he wasn't helping Sam around the house, he spent his time reading books about wildlife or sketching animals in an old notebook he'd found in the cabin. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ethan turned to Sam. "Do you think Mom and Dad will notice that I've changed?" "They'll notice," Sam said confidently. "You've grown, Ethan, and they'll be proud of you. I know I am." Ethan smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thanks, Grandpa, for everything." Sam nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You're welcome, but don't thank me too much. It was you who did the hard work." As the days passed, the empty enclosure stood as a quiet reminder of the journey they'd taken together. Ethan and Sam's bond had grown stronger, built not just on shared responsibility but on mutual respect. They had both changed, Ethan learning to care and take responsibility, and Sam rediscovering the joy of teaching and guiding someone he loved. And though the Bobcats were gone, their impact lingered, shaping the lives they had touched and leaving behind a story of growth, redemption, and the enduring power of second chances. A few weeks later, the cabin felt quieter than ever. The enclosure in the backyard sat empty, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. The tools and supplies Sam and Ethan had used to care for the Bobcats were packed neatly away in the shed, but the memories of their work and the lessons they had learned remained. Ethan stood on the porch, looking out at the forest beyond the yard. His notebook was tucked under his arm, its pages filled with sketches of bobcats and notes about their behaviors. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the treetops, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant birds. Sam joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Ethan and leaned on the porch railing, following his grandson's gaze. "Thinking about them?" he asked. "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "I keep wondering how they're doing, if they're okay." "They're doing just fine," Sam said confidently. "They've got instincts, skills, and each other. That's all they need." Ethan nodded, sipping his tea. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" "Maybe," Sam said with a shrug, "but bobcats are good at staying hidden. If we do, it'll be because they want us to." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the glow of the setting sun giving way to the cool blue of twilight. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter. "This summer, it was different. I didn't think I'd learn anything here. I thought it'd just be boring." Sam chuckled. "And?" Ethan smiled. "And I was wrong. I learned a lot, not just about the bobcats, but about everything, about caring for something, and not just giving up when it gets hard." Sam nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "That's the most important lesson, Ethan. And it's one that'll serve you well, no matter what you do." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then turned to face Sam. "I want to do something with this. I mean, not just drawing or writing about animals. I want to help them, like we did." Sam raised an eyebrow. "You thinking about studying wildlife or something?" "Maybe," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. "I don't know yet, but I want to make a difference. For animals, for people. I don't want to waste time doing stuff that doesn't matter." Sam smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "You've got a good heart, Ethan, and I have no doubt you'll figure it out. Whatever you decide to do, you'll make it count." The next morning, Ethan packed his things into the old duffel bag he'd brought at the start of the summer. The walls of the cabin, which had once felt so confining to him, now seemed like a place of transformation, a home that had given him clarity and purpose. As he stood by the truck, ready to head back to his parents' house, Ethan turned to Sam. "I'll visit soon," he said, "and maybe we can do this again. Help more animals, I mean." Sam grinned. "You're always welcome here, and there's always work to be done." As the truck rumbled away, carrying Ethan back to the city, Sam stood on the porch, watching until it disappeared down the dirt road. He felt a sense of bittersweet pride, knowing the summer was over, but confident that it had left a lasting impact. That evening, as Sam sat alone on the porch, a movement in the distance caught his eye. A flash of golden fur darted between the trees. His heart leapt as he recognized the sleek form of the mother bobcat, her cubs trailing behind her. They paused briefly at the edge of the yard, their sharp eyes watching him. Sam smiled, lifting his hand in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. The mother bobcat tilted her head, then turned and disappeared into the woods, her cubs following close behind. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. As the stars filled the sky above the cabin, Sam leaned back in his chair, his wooden porch creaking softly beneath him. The work they had done, the bonds they had built, and the lessons they had learned, all came together in that moment. Life had a way of moving forward, but it also had a way of leaving reminders of hope, of growth, and of second chances. The Bobcats were gone, but their legacy remained. And as Sam sat there, the night stretching out before him, he knew this was only the beginning, for them, for Ethan, and for himself.